Hello. Today I'm going to answer a member's question from Yasmin Gordal. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Yasmin asks, I would like to ask you what your view of the sources, or review of the sources rather, Polydor Virgil and Domenico Mancini, and what I personally think their strengths and weaknesses are, particularly with regards to what they said about the events of the Wars of the Roses. Sources for English history, and yet of course Polydor Virgil and Domenico Mancini, these are not English names, they are Italian names, and they're not written in English or even Italian, they're written in Latin, because both Polydor and Mancini are products of the Italian Renaissance, the extraordinary transformation of attitudes to language, to history, to facts, to sources that in fundamental ways lies at the beginning of that process that I talked about right at the beginning in the very first, the very personal statement about my own view of history, in which you try to make history about sources, about documents, about fact, and you try to make it about facts which are true and are known and are demonstrable to be true. And Mancini and Virgil are at the beginning of that process, trained in Italy in the Italian universities, skilled in the new approaches to Latin, skilled in the evaluation of sources, skilled, I think, too, in human nature and understanding human nature. They've thought about it. So they're cutting-edge sources. What do they tell us about, Yasmin is interested in, particularly the history of the Wars of the Roses? Now, the two books, although they've got very considerable similarities, have an enormous difference in scope and ambition. The edition of Mancini by C.A.J. Armstrong, it tells you it's the usurpation of Richard III. In other words, it's a very short text about a short period of time. It is literally the accounts of Richard's reign from his plot to seize the throne until the end of that first year of his, or first few months of his reign, 1483, and it breaks off in 1483 when Mancini returns to France, and as far as we know, in fact we can guess very reliably, to submit this text to official sources in France, where it is used as the basis of the speech of the French Chancellor when the Estates General are opened in January 1484. Here again, I'm asked to give a personal view. I don't really have a personal view on that text. I've taken it for what it is, a remarkable, in other words, eyewitness account. This is contemporary history, written by somebody as events are unfolding in front of him, and of extraordinary importance in one especial detail, the detail that towards the end of his narrative, he makes absolutely clear that he thinks the princes have been disposed of, probably dead, and indeed on the basis of his narrative, as I said at the beginning of 1484, January 1484, the French Chancellor, in the opening of the Estates General, that's sort of the equivalent of the French Parliament, actually makes the formal charge against Richard that he has murdered his nephews, and that he obviously usurped the throne, but to do so that he has actually murdered Edward and murdered Edward V and murdered Richard, Duke of York. So the text then has, I suppose, in my view, and as a well-known anti-Ricardian, in other words, believer in truth, the text has the extraordinary importance of offering the first clear, documented evidence that contemporaries actually believe in the murder of the princes in the Tower. Everybody in England, or everybody who matters in England, behaves as though they were dead. They don't actually say so. This implies very clearly, and directly based upon it, there is an assertion informal language that Richard was responsible for their deaths. Now, if I've been uncharacteristically brief on the subject of Mancini, I'm going to be characteristically long on the subject of Polydor Virgil. Virgil is a text that I've used ever since my earliest researches way back in the late 1960s, and it's a text about which I have constantly new thoughts and discover new things. Yasmin helps me to focus a bit because she says she wants to know about the Wars of the Roses. Now, let's get one or two facts about Polydor firmly in our minds. He comes to England as an agent of a Roman cardinal, as an agent of Adriano. Adriano is usually known in English later on as Cardinal Hadrian. Adriano Castellesi. This point high in favour in Rome, high in favour in the circle of Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, and he's the agent for he's Polydor when he is sent to, when Polydor is sent to England, he is Adriano's agent to act as collector of papal taxation, the infamous Peter's pence. And Polydor, sent to England in 1502, has a couple of trips back to Italy, but otherwise he really remains in England, astonishingly. He's a very, very long-lived man until the end of the reign of Edward VI and his return to Italy, to die there, from which he actually writes a letter congratulating Mary on her accession to the throne. An astonishing life which stretches from Henry VII right the way through to the middle of Tudor England. 1502 he arrives. He does not start writing his history probably until 1506 at the direct invitation of King Henry VII. And his history then continues until his history begins, as far as he's concerned, at the beginning of English history. It's an enormously ambitious work. It goes right back to the beginnings and it takes it through to the reign of Henry VIII. So for much of the time, Polydor, for most of the time, in fact, before 1502, Polydor is dependent on sources and dependent on what he can learn either from written sources or from others. He's the first, in fact, to take a strictly critical approach to the sources of English history. He is much denounced by contemporary Englishmen, who, by the way, steal from him very extensively when he's gone into print. He's nevertheless denounced because he disbelieves the matter of Britain. He is one of the first, in fact, probably the first, frontally to challenge the idea that the legend of King Arthur is anything more than a legend. He demonstrates that none of the dates fit with the known facts of Roman history and that it is in fact a myth. He also discovers what is the earliest authentic text on English or British history, the work of the monkish chronicler, the Celtic chronicler, Gildas, and he actually publishes an excellent edition of the text. As we can see, he's a man who understands, I was arguing before, understands sources, does very modern things like transcribe them, puts them into print in a good edition. But Yasmin is interested in what he's got to tell us about the Wars of the Roses. Well, clearly, only arriving in England in 1502, he has no direct knowledge of the Wars of the Roses. They finish, if we take the conventional date, in 1485, which is the beginning of the reign of Henry VII, and 17 years have elapsed from that point to his arrival in England. So what can he have directly that's new, that's important, if anything, to tell us about the Wars of the Roses? Well, I think he's got a very great deal, because when you read Polydor's account, particularly, this is very telling, when you read Polydor's account, he's commissioned by Henry VII, essentially, to write a history of England that I think in the way it was originally conceived, that would actually have culminated in the history of the reign of Henry VII as the grand finale of English history. It's from the beginning till now, and however much, of course, Polydor might have attacked the idea of Arthur, as we know, Henry VII actually names his eldest son Arthur, so there's that sense implicit in the name of this as the culmination or the conclusion or the arc of English Anglo-British history, if you like. So this then is the central theme, Henry VII. And it's at this point, I think, the origins of Henry VII, Henry Earl of Richmond, and his struggle under Richard III, his actual seizure of the throne, his remarkable clinging on to the throne. It's at this point that Virgil suddenly becomes alive. The description of the plots in London that follow Richard III's accession, the plots between Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, the mother of Henry Earl of Richmond, and Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Dowager, Edward IV's Queen Dowager, in refuge, in sanctuary in Westminster, knowing that her sons are first dethroned and imprisoned, and then suspecting and almost certainly knowing that they are dead. Those plots that begin to emerge right in the summer of 1483 between Lady Margaret and the Queen Dowager, the plots to marry Margaret's son, Henry Earl of Richmond, to the eldest daughter and therefore the principal claimant to the Yorkist throne, to the Princess Elizabeth. Those plots, as they swirl together with around the Tower, with Louis Caerleon coming and going, between the Tower and the sanctuary, where the Queen Dowager is, that extraordinary sense of secret communication, the swirling of plots again as you get the involvement of John Morton, the Bishop of Ely, and famously, of course, arrested by Richard at the actual council table, the whole business when he is sent off to gather strawberries in the garden at Ely Place, still Ely Place, off Fleet Street. He's sent there at the junction of Fleet Street and Cheapside. He is sent there to gather strawberries whilst the council proceeds to the bloodier business, and you get the arrest of Lord Hastings, and dragged from the council chamber to in the Tower to immediate execution on a log outside. All of that, there's just that wonderful swirl of events, the detail, the blood, the colour. Is it imagination? I would say absolutely not, because we can form the shrewdest suspicion of who is talking to him. And there's been a lot of, talking to Polydor that is, there's been a lot of misunderstanding of this. If you read in some of the great Tudor historians, like my own teacher, Geoffrey Elton, you'll find really very strange misunderstandings, like the idea that Polydor's source was John Morton himself. There is a terrible problem. Morton had been dead 2 years before Polydor arrives in England. It's amazing how even the Homer of Tudor history, Geoffrey Elton, could sleep at times. The source is different. It's at a lower level, but it's an extraordinarily interesting figure. It is, I am convinced, his principal source. Oh, there's possibly Thomas More, and there's probably Richard Fox. But the name that runs like a thread, like the proverbial Brighton in the stick of rock, through these accounts of the extraordinary goings on, the plottings in London, the plottings in Kent, the plottings in Brittany, the plottings in the Netherlands, the culmination of the plots on the French coast as the invasion fleet is launched. The key figure in all of this, the man who's there everywhere, well, he actually appears, interestingly enough, as single moment in Shakespeare's Richard III. It is a man called Christopher Urswick, that wonderful northern name, Urswick. He's born very near me. I was born in Kendal, in Westmoreland. He's born a bit to the north slightly and to the west in Furness, in that section of Lancashire which lies on the northern shore of Morecambe Bay and was connected to Lancashire itself by shipping, by the fact that it was very much easier to go across the bay by boat than to go round the bay and through the foothills of the Lake District on foot. And there is a great abbey there, Furness Abbey, on the outskirts of what is now Barrow-in-Furness, built magnificently in red sandstone, this extraordinary structure, this vivid red stone against this astonishing green landscape. Green because it's always very wet, my abiding memory. And his father is the lay brother of the abbey. He is passionately a passionately observant Catholic. He is a priest. This is Christopher. He goes to Cambridge. He must have gone to a local grammar school or the Abbey School, and he goes to Cambridge, and he has a very impressive career at Cambridge. But of course, he's born when? He's born in about 1448, 1450, exactly on the eve of the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses. And he is born in Lancashire. He is, in fact, a passionate Lancastrian, and he is associated with the Stanley family, mighty in Lancashire, though more importantly further south. And of course, their connection with that whole area is through the marriage of Lady Margaret Beaufort to Lady Margaret Beaufort to Thomas Stanley. All of these connections come into play. Probably, we don't know quite when, but around the time of the usurpation, late Edward IV, the usurpation of Richard III in 1483, this young man, this young priest as he then was, is recruited by Lady Margaret Beaufort. And she recruits him, Polydor says. In other words, it's Urswick who is talking to Polydor. It's Urswick who is giving him these extraordinary details. He is recruited, Urswick is recruited by Lady Margaret Beaufort, he tells Polydor. Because why? Because he's a known Lancastrian and he's known to be loyal to the memory of Henry VI, passionately devoted to him, which will form an important part of his career later on. Lady Margaret uses him as her principal intermediary in those early negotiations with the Queen Dowager about the marriage of Henry, Earl of Richmond, to the Princess Elizabeth. He's the one who tells us about Caerleon's role, the doctor, the Welsh doctor, come necromancer, and he's the one who tells us about that role. He's then used Lady Margaret as the plot starts to move forward. Lady Margaret wants to send him off to her son in Brittany to explain to him what is exactly going on. But that's the moment at which that other independent line of plotting round the Duke of Buckingham, again, as far as we know, moving with, perhaps inspired by the John Morton, the Bishop of Ely, who by this time is his prisoner. He moves against Richard. Buckingham moves against Richard III, and Buckingham, of course, had been the man who played the most important part in putting Richard on the throne. He had acted really as Richard's impresario, stage manager. Buckingham had been very much excluded from the politics, although he's the richest and the most important of the dukes. He'd been excluded from politics by Edward IV, and he now takes his revenge by stage managing Richard III onto the throne. But of course, having created Richard III, as king, despite the vast rewards he's given, he's not satisfied. He wants more, and when Richard refuses to give him more, He rebels. And at that point, of course, a whole cascade of revolts break out effectively prematurely. And the in the aftermath of the failure of Buckingham's revolt and the revolts that had been put together by usually alienated members of the House of York, of the following of the House of York, because all these plots that go on in Kent and in the West Country, their leaders are not so much people who've been identified with the House of Lancaster. As I've argued to you before, the House of Lancaster is effectively obliterated. It's not effectively obliterated, it is obliterated by Edward IV in the massacre that follows the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471. So the people who join in these provincial revolts are are people who've been Yorkist loyalists. They've been people very much at the heart of the following which Edward IV had recruited, the wearers of the badge of the Rose en Soleil, the white rose surmounted by his symbol of the sun. You remember the opening of Richard III. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the sun of York, the sun badge, like Louis XIV, but imposed upon the white rose. These are the people who wear that, who are the king's followers in the counties, particularly in the counties of the south, and especially in Kent. These are the people who, out of loyalty to Edward IV, loyalty to his sons, strong connections with the Woodvilles, they rise against Richard III. Their risings are triggered prematurely by the moves of Buckingham himself, and they're all defeated, and those who are lucky enough to escape Richard flee abroad to join Henry Earl of Richmond in his exile in Brittany. And it's at this point, of course, that we get another set of plots taking place. What's going on in Brittany, and Richard's desperate attempts at getting his hands on Henry Earl of Richmond in Brittany through the treasurer of Duke Francis II of Brittany. And these plots come very, very near to success. And here again, we have another moment of vivid accounts from the involvement, the eyewitness of Urswick himself. In the aftermath of the failure of Buckingham's revolt, Urswick seems to have gone not to Brittany, but he'd gone to join Morton, who by this point is in exile and safety in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, Morton, of course, who had been a highly active diplomat, had got a finger in every pie, lots and lots of contacts in England. He hears in the Netherlands of Richard's plots to spring, to have Henry handed over to him, and by Pierre Landais, the treasurer of Duke Francis, to have Henry handed over to the English emissaries in Brittany and bundled off to England and to certain execution. So Morton gets to hear of these plots in the Netherlands, and what does he do again, just in the same way that Urswick, this active, able, clearly physically very active, very courageous, passionately committed and partisan priest, in the same way that Lady Margaret Beaufort uses him for her plotting with the Queen Dowager and the Duke of Buckingham. So again, Morton uses him, is sent right across France to Brittany, from the east to the west of France to Brittany, to alert Henry Earl of Richmond in his exile in Brittany that he's at risk of being captured. And at that point, what does Henry VII do? He immediately believes the warning that he's given by Urswick. He makes use of him again, this astonishing sheer physical activity. And Urswick is sent off to the court of the French king, to the newly acceded to the throne after the death of Louis XI, Charles VIII, to ask permission. Could Henry Earl of Richmond, shift his place of exile from Brittany. He's at Vannes in the east, very near the French border in Brittany. Could he slink across the border and seek refuge at the French court? And the French king says, and his sister Anne of Beaujeu says, yes, please, because of course at this point relations between England and, as almost always, relations between England and France are bad, between Charles VIII and Richard III are bad. And of course, Henry is now very much an official pretender to the throne. He's the alternative candidate to the throne, and therefore having him in French hands is a wonderful counterpiece against Richard III. And so Henry makes this with Urswick with him, and Henry makes that extraordinary flight for his life with a handful of servants in disguise, charges across the French frontier and escapes. Urswick is there. That's why Polydor can tell us these wonderful stories about what's going on, and why we can believe those stories. This, Yasmin, is why the account of Polydor Virgil is so important. It is effectively, for all of this plotting, because of the role of essentially Urswick, it is a kind of eyewitness account, but written with the shape, with the sense of drama, with the force of language of Polydor Virgil as a very significant writer, and able. He's profoundly experienced already, though a relatively young man, profoundly experienced as a writer. He's composed vast encyclopedias and all this sort of thing. He's a highly skilled writer, and you get that wonderful sense of driving narrative, which again, of course, goes from Polydor into large chunks of Hall's Chronicle and directly into Shakespeare. So Polydor really is this very, very important source for that last phase of the Wars of the Roses. And again, Urswick, we know, though not directly from Polydor himself, we know it from Bernard André, the very different, ambly, old-fashioned, sort of, he's writing in Latin, bad Latin also, but Henry VII's official historiographer, who is a French Augustinian friar, Bernard André, and it's André who tells us that Urswick, along indeed with André himself and Richard Fox, is one of the three clergymen at the Battle of Bosworth. So again, there's accounts of the march through Wales, Henry Earl of Richmond's march through Wales, having landed at Milford Haven, and how all the various powers in Wales start to join him as he gathers strength, marching across Wales towards the confrontation with Richard at Bosworth. Again, that wonderful sense of this person comes in this day, the other person comes in the other day. That is Urswick, yes. Maybe even at that point, Henry VII himself, fascinated by history, which is why he's commissioned Virgil to write it, and undoubtedly a record keeper and recorder, and a man of profoundly impressive memory. So this is why we get this remarkable sense of vividness, of actuality, of direct reporting. There's another way now in which Urswick, I'm absolutely sure, becomes very important. So here is this man, been at the absolute heart of the plotting that's put Henry VII on the throne, first in England at the beginning of Richard III's reign, and then as the great orchestration of plots with French support at the end of Richard's reign culminate in for him, the terrible day of Bosworth. Christopher then is the absolute heart of the Tudor following. He's one of the great loyalists. He's a central figure. He's immediately made royal almoner one of the key clerical roles about the king. And he's sent off at that point as a man in absolute trust. And clearly, I made the point about physical activity on the one hand, but clearly also diplomatic and negotiating skills. He's sent off in early 1486 to negotiate with Rome in the very delicate matter, much more delicate than has been thought, in the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and the papal endorsement of that marriage, and how the papal endorsement of that marriage will be used as the first Yorkist rebellions break out that lead to the Battle of Stoke, how the papal endorsement of that marriage will be used as the great grounds of Henry VII's legitimacy and so on. I don't mean legitimacy in terms of birth, I mean legitimacy in terms of his claim to the throne. Christopher is at the heart of the process, in other words, that gets, in most unusual fashion, direct papal support for a partisan claim to the English throne, the direct papal support for the Tudor claim to the throne. That again is Christopher, this central figure. And again, the vividness of the reporting of this in Polydor is very striking. But then things go wrong. Things go wrong in the relationship between Urswick and Henry VII. Urswick still hasn't reached the summit of his career. Summit of his career is when he's given that profoundly intimate, still clerical appointment, Dean of Windsor and Registrar of the Order of the Garter. One of the most intimate clerical appointments about the monarch. But he does something very extraordinary. In 1505, he resigns. Urswick resigns. In other words, he has become disillusioned. This man who'd been at the heart of the Tudor following has become disillusioned. That process of disillusionment, I think I can show, also colours Polydor's history just as much as that early enthusiasm and passionate activity which Urswick had displayed on behalf of the Tudors as well. So here we have Urswick, the young partisan, in later life becoming disenchanted, detached, even perhaps toying with a kind of gentle opposition. It couldn't be anything but gentle, otherwise in Tudor England unpleasant things happened to you. And this too colours profoundly Polydor's text. Now here again we need a little pause. The Polydor's chronicle up to the end of Richard III's reign only survives in its eventual printed form. There is no manuscript. However, from the accession of Henry VII in 1485 to about 1513 in the reign of Henry VIII, there is an actual manuscript which survives in the Vatican, and it differs very considerably from the later printed text. There are several of these at different editions, beginning in 1535 and going right through to the end of Polydor's life. So for this crucial section of the reign of Henry VII and the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, we do actually have a manuscript of Polydor's own manuscript. It survives, along with so many other infinite riches, in the library of the Vatican. It was known earlier on, it was known as early as the beginning of the 20th century in the work of Cardinal Gasquet, the Roman Catholic historian, who of course has got as cardinal, has got one of the earliest English cardinals. He's got very strong contacts. He's scholarly. He's got very strong contacts in the Vatican, and he actually sees this manuscript and calls attention to it. But as we know it now, this manuscript is known through the work of Dennis Hay, who becomes professor at Edinburgh. He starts work on it before the Second World War. He has photocopies made, which are deposited in Bodley, in the library at Oxford, and he spends. It is the culmination of his doctorate, and his reputation is the edition and translation of of the original manuscript of Virgil's History of the Reign of Henry VII and the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. The edition is very important, and in some ways is very good. In other ways, it's extremely difficult to use. First of all, Hay doesn't make clear, save in footnotes, the different texts of the history. So you have the Latin of the manuscript on the left-hand side of the page, and his English translation, which is good and clear, on the right-hand side of the page. And then the variant texts of the subsequent printed editions are at the bottom, only in Latin, which I'm afraid means that because historians' Latin is less good than it used to be, not enough use has been made of the differences between the two texts, as later on pressure of political circumstances, altering views of what's important, leads Polydor to edit his text. Now, why all of this? How does all this fit with our friend Christopher? Why did I break off in 1505 when Christopher resigns as Dean of Windsor? What's going on? Well, look at that date, 1505. This is the moment, of course, in which Empson and Dudley, the Henry VII's infamous two financial agents, those dominant figures of the last years of the reign. This is the moment at which they come to full prominence. Edmund Dudley, had been appointed to his role as extraordinary collector of revenues a little bit earlier, in the autumn, October of 1504, and Empson is taking over as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and the head of the Council Learned at Law exactly at this period too, and it's in 1505 that his position fully emerges. So is there then a connection between Christopher's resignation and the emergence of Empson and Dudley? I think it is absolutely certain that there is. Christopher, as I've described him, is passionately committed to the House of Tudor, or at least had been passionately committed to the House of Tudor. But he is, above all, a churchman, and he sees and is attached seriously to the wealth, the power, the privileges, the status, the untouchability of the church. And exactly what happens, of course, and we forget this, one of the principal targets of the huge revenue-raising policies of Empson and Dudley is the church. Because, again, Polydor, probably directly out of the mouth of Urswick, Polydor emphasises in his account of the depredations of Empson and Dudley, which we will talk about much more fully in a moment, Polydor's actual account, the physical nature of that account in the manuscript, edited and translated by Hay. Polydor makes absolutely clear that what is peculiar, it's even more peculiar in the European context, what is peculiar about the revenue-raising activities of Empson and Dudley is that they target the rich. They go for the rich. They go for the landed classes. They go for the aristocracy. They go very, very much so, very heavily for the great merchants, the merchant princes of London, the members of the city elite, the end of Henry VII's reign. I think it's 3 Lord Mayors are imprisoned at the same time for having refused to go along with the policies of Henry. 3 Lord Mayors. Anyway, the third group, so you've got the aristocracy, you've got the mercantile elite, and you've got the church. Empson and Dudley go for the church, for all the wealth of the church, the wealth of individual churchmen, not even sparing Warham, not even sparing Fox, not even sparing, of course, Urswick himself. They are very rich. Urswick, although he never held a bishopric, has immensely rich benefices and huge numbers of them. Great. Because he's in high favour. He's a great pluralist and accumulates a very substantial fortune in ready cash. And this is under pressure. This is under constant pressure from Empson and Dudley. How do we know? What is it that suggests that this is the grounds of Christopher's break with Henry Tudor? Well, it's the date. It's 1505, but it's also his involvement, it's also Christopher's involvement in a particular text by another Italian called Celso Maffei, and it's called the Dissuasio. And this is the dissuasion, an argument against clerical taxation. It's a translation of an Italian work, and it's associated with Christopher in 2 forms. Christopher, like many sophisticates of this period, didn't really very much like print. He thought print was a little bit vulgar, and he is a great patron of the famous copyist, the one-eyed copyist, Peter Megan, who is familiar also as copying works for, especially for Thomas More. Actually appears in one of Thomas More's own poems, as you know, this one-eyed this one-eyed copyist, and one of the texts that Megan copies for Urswick is this text by Maffei. There's also a printed version of it, published again in 1505, which is powerfully associated with Urswick. So we have Urswick arguing against the state pillaging of the church. Remember, this is the paradox. Henry VII himself, one of the most ostentatiously pious of kings, but that not stopping him from getting his hands on as much clerical wealth as he could. How does this play into Virgil? How does it play into the actual texts of Virgil? The way that manuscript, edited and transcribed by Hay, is put together. What is very striking, I think, is that it is Urswick who, in just the same way that he had been the source of that wonderfully enthusiastic, daring-do narrative of the reign of Richard III and the beginning of Henry VII, I think it's probably Urswick who is the key source that informs Polydor about the reaction to Henry VII's later fiscal policies, his what is frankly called by Polydor his avarice, and above all the hatred of Empson and Dudley. You have, in other words, a very important English source telling Polydor, of course, who was highly intelligent and well informed and lots of contacts, what is actually going on and what is the reaction to it. And I think it takes another very important form. If you actually look at the famous account in Polydor Virgil, in the manuscript version of Polydor Virgil of Empson and Dudley, what you see is it is a very, very long interpolation. It is literally a separate essay on Empson and Dudley, which is interpolated, which is slotted in to what is a pre-written text, and you can see where the earlier section stops, and the interpolation actually finishes, you can even see, although curiously enough Hay does not particularly call attention to this, you can even see how it is physically, because the manuscript was written on loose leaves, you can see how this section is actually physically slotted in to a pre-written text. What is it? Well, this, I think, takes us into the heart of something even deeper. Polydor was actually known to be writing his history. Polydor is known to be at work, as I said, from 1506. So he's at work for the last 3 years of Henry VII's reign. In this period of time, he's not only clearly intimate with Urswick, as I've described, who, by the way, Urswick now is actually living near London. Just to the north of London, he's been made rector of Hackney, and now we think of Hackney as vibrant. Then it was actually one of the richest benefices in the Church of England, and with all the wealth that he's got, Urswick maintains clearly a kind of, I would have thought, elegant villa lifestyle there. He rebuilds the rectory, rebuilds the church, at least the tower of the church and so on, creates a splendid tomb for himself, which, though the church is gone, the tomb actually survives in the later church of St. John's, Hackney. So he's very convenient. We can imagine, I think, Polydor spending agreeable weekends as they talk together and reminisce and exchange notes and denounce Empson and Dudley. And again, there's another very interesting contact of Polydor in this period, directly with Lady Margaret Beaufort herself, because Polydor is effectively the Pope's principal agent. He's almost acting as a kind of papal, he's not formally a nuncio, but he's effectively acting as the Pope's main representative in England. He plays a very important part in getting the papal agreement to the kind of things that Lady Margaret Beaufort wants at this point, to her chantry in Westminster, and above all to her colleges as they start to develop at Cambridge, to first of all to Christ's College as God's House is renamed, and then to her new grand foundation of St. John's, and Polydor plays a very important part in getting the necessary papal bulls, and he actually goes and stays with Lady Margaret periods of time, and we know this from Lady Margaret's accounts. He goes and stays with her in her great Northamptonshire palace of Collyweston. And what does Lady Margaret Beaufort do in those last days of the reign, those last fraught days of the reign, when Henry VII has had that protracted deathbed scene? He falls ill just at the beginning of Lent, proclaims that he has had a deathbed conversion, that he bitterly regrets his avarice and whatever, and begins that extraordinary long process, slow, agonised process of dying, which he doesn't complete until the 22nd of April. And Lady Margaret, about 10 days before that, turns up at court, turns up at Richmond, and one of the first things she does is summons Polydor to court. The historian is actually summoned to court as the king is dying, as there will be this moment of transformation and change from one reign to the next. So Polydor is now literally himself in the heart of politics, observing politics, having been primed by Urswick. And what does he do, I think? I think this is the moment at which he writes effectively to Lady Margaret's dictation that profoundly hostile account of Empson and Dudley, who are there made to carry much of the blame for Henry VII's avarice, which of course is the thing that Henry thinks, that his clerical advisors, his confessor, think, that Lady Margaret Beaufort herself clearly thinks is the thing that risks the condemnation of his soul, its failure to enter purgatory, and its risk of condemnation to hell. In other words, I think Urswick, that sense of clerical outrage at the behaviour of Empson and Dudley. I think Urswick, as he was so often in his career, is part of something much bigger, because it's quite clear that Urswick is not alone in that reaction. I think Lady Margaret Beaufort shared it. I think too Lady Margaret Beaufort's confessor. This is the moment at which John Fisher becomes Lady Margaret Beaufort's confessor from 1504 onwards, and moves into the heart of her circle, and again is there when Polydor Virgil is with her at Collyweston. And this is the moment, of course, at which the king also gets a new confessor. Like so many other of his earlier confessors, a Frenchman, a new royal confessor emerges, and the two confessors, the confessor of Lady Margaret Beaufort and the confessor of the king, work together. This is a separate story which I will tell, so I won't go into detail here. They work together at Cambridge, they work together to get the building of King's College Chapel finished, and they work together above all to save the soul of Henry VII. And the saving of the soul of Henry VII involves the condemnation of Empson and Dudley and that extraordinary coup d'etat. What I'm arguing, in fact, is, and I shall argue much more fully, that there is a coup d'etat, which a clerically staged coup d'etat, which surrounds the deathbed of Henry VII and the accession of Henry VIII. And think, therefore, what we have now. We have in Urswick, in his role as a leader of if you like, clerical resistance. It's passive resistance, but resignation in Tudor England is extraordinarily unusual. We have Urswick, this man with the long record of contact with Virgil, of acting as his contact. We have Urswick, I think, colouring, predisposing Virgil to understand this, to give him again the documented detail that he uses. And we have Lady Margaret Beaufort herself summoning Virgil to court, and I think literally telling him what to write, dictating the essential content, the essential thrust is absolutely the right word, of the attack on Empson and Dudley that appears in the manuscript version of his history. And the striking thing, of course, is that extraordinarily intense attack on Empson and Dudley is largely eliminated from subsequent editions. Again, when my old teacher Geoffrey Elton was writing about this in his attempts to prove that Henry VII wasn't avaricious, wasn't anything out of the extraordinary, Elton assumed that attack on Empson and Dudley was a product of Virgil looking back. It wasn't. It was an actual piece of current reporting. Just in other words, exactly like Armstrong, it's a piece of contemporary history, literally written under the blow of the moment. But what, as the subsequent editions go on, happens is that account is toned down and largely eliminated. Why? Well, of course, for the simple reason, I would say, Henry VII, after having begun his reign as a very, very conscious reaction against his father, Henry VIII starts very much to follow in the footsteps of Henry VIII. Most famously, of course, with the huge attack on the wealth of the church, which follows his need for a divorce and the pressure to be applied to the church from the beginning of the 1530s, and the whole role of Thomas Cromwell in managing that attack on the wealth of the church, as well as, of course, on the legislative independence and standing and authority of the church. In other words, that attack on everything which had been held dear by Christopher Urswick. What is Cromwell doing? Cromwell is following directly, I would argue even modelling himself on particularly on Edmund Dudley. seems to me, even to the extent of basing himself in London and so on, rather than at court. Cromwell's great centre of operations is in the Rolls Chapel off Chancery Lane. He's basing himself there. He's using, exactly like Edmund Dudley, he's using his knowledge of common law and so on as part of this process of the pillaging of the church. In other words, to attack Empson and Dudley is, in a sense, to attack Thomas Cromwell. Or indeed, it is to attack Henry VIII. So you can see why you cut back and then effectively drop the references to the wicked avarice of Henry VII, and more particularly the role that's played in that by Empson and Dudley. But somebody else gets dropped too, as the subsequent editions of Polydor Virgil develop. Poor old Urswick virtually vanishes from the text after the beginning of Henry VII's reign. Urswick, having been that principal informant of Polydor Virgil, becomes a non-person, because he had been one of the first, the most effective defenders of the wealth, the privilege, the independence and the authority of the church. That will not do in the 1530s, so poor old Urswick has to go from Polydor's text. In other words, I've gone on a long time, Yasmin, but I think it's important. Not only then is Polydor this absolutely crucial witness to the coup that brings Henry VII to the throne, he is also the crucial witness to that other coup. Henry VII's reign begins and ends with a coup. It begins with Henry VII, Henry Earl of Richmond's own military coup against Richard III, and then it ends with what I would argue is a clerical or clericalist coup by Stephen Barons, that's the king's confessor, Etienne Baron, he's French, as all Henry VII's confessors were, and by John Fisher, these two royal confessors, and Lady Margaret herself, a clericalist coup against the lawyer fiscal advisors of Henry VII, partly to rescue the king's soul, partly to pave the way to a smooth succession of Henry VIII. And the victims are, those victims are Empson and Dudley, but it is later on poor old Fisher, poor old Urswick, who himself becomes another victim, as those events at the end of Henry VII's reign, that clericalist coup, and indeed the highly clericalist regime that manages politics for the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, as all of that clericalist episode is reviewed, reassessed and rejected, not least by Henry VIII himself as part of the assumption of royal supremacy over the church, then poor old Urswick has to go. He begins as the informant and omnipresent. He becomes the unperson and vanishes. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase T-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.